The terror began before anyone understood what they were witnessing. 8 tanks rolled through the smoke of Iwo Jima's beaches. They appeared identical to every other Sherman. Olive drab paint, standard turrets. Nothing distinguished them from the hundreds of other armored vehicles grinding across volcanic ash. Then came the sound. A sharp hiss cut through the battlefield noise. What followed changed everything. A jet of liquid fire stretched 150 yards. It poured into Japanese bunkers like molten metal. Screams erupted briefly. Then silence. For 74 days, American warships had hammered this island. Thousands of tons of explosives had churned the black sand. The bombardment achieved nothing. Underground defenders waited patiently in their tunnels. But these 8 mystery tanks accomplished what months of shelling could not. They turned concrete fortresses into crematoriums. They made Japanese soldiers abandon positions they had sworn to defend with their lives. They transformed the mathematics of battle itself. How did ordinary Shermans become instruments of such terror? The story begins not on Iwo Jima's beaches, but in the humid workshops of Hawaii. There, desperate men worked through sleepless nights. Their mission was urgent: create a weapon that could burn enemies from their caves. The portable flamethrowers were failing. Marines carrying 70 pounds of fuel died before reaching their targets. Loss rates climbed above 70%. Something revolutionary was needed. Colonel George Unmacht understood this better than most. At 58 years old, with 4 decades of military service behind him, he had witnessed the promise and peril of flame weapons. He assembled an unlikely team. Soldiers from the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company worked alongside Navy Seabees. Tank crews collaborated with machinists and electricians. Their names would never appear in headlines, but their work would save thousands of lives. The early attempts were crude failures. Portable flamethrowers strapped to tank hulls broke down constantly. The range was pathetic. 60 yards maximum before the fuel ran out. Marines nicknamed them one-shot wonders, for good reason. Then 2 Seabees changed everything. Machinist mate First Class A. Riker and Electrician's mate Second Class Joseph Kissel began experimenting. They scavenged parts from British systems. They copied mechanisms from captured German designs. They borrowed ignition methods from Navy equipment. Piece by piece, they welded a monster into existence. The result was called the CBH-1, Construction Battalion Hawaii Model 1. This weapon was revolutionary in ways no one fully understood. Previous systems spat fire like oversized blowtorches. The CBH-1 hurled flame with artillery force, 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, nearly triple the older designs. The range extended to 150 yards. The fuel was thickened with napalm to cling to surfaces, to seep into cracks, to burn at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit for minutes after impact. Most critically, the flame gun replaced the Sherman's main cannon entirely. This meant full turret traverse. The gunner could aim fire just as precisely as he aimed shells, through the same periscopes, with the same targeting systems. Inside each converted tank, 290 gallons of fuel waited, enough for 80 seconds of continuous fire. Doctrine recommended short bursts of 2 to 3 seconds. But crews knew in desperate moments they could pour out rivers of flame until their reservoirs ran completely dry. Safety became paramount after early flame tanks exploded when hit. The CBH-1 used nitrogen instead of compressed air for pressurization. If punctured, the nitrogen would not ignite. Engineers added multiple fail-safes to prevent catastrophic explosions. Every conversion required 1,200 man-hours of work, 150 pounds of welding rod, over 1,000 electrical connections. Each tank cost as much as a house in 1944. But the men working at Schofield Barracks did not think about costs. They thought about Marines dying in caves shot down before reaching their targets. They thought about the element of surprise these weapons would provide. The tanks were painted in standard olive drab. No special markings identified them. To Japanese observers, they looked like ordinary Shermans. Until the moment the first hiss sounded. Until the first jet of fire erupted from what should have been a cannon barrel. It was a marriage of American industrial power and battlefield desperation. Men worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping on cots beside their welding equipment. They ate cold rations from tins without complaint. They knew nothing of glory or recognition. They knew only that lives depended on their work. By autumn 1944, 8 M4A3 Shermans had been completely transformed. Ordinary machines of war had become engines of liquid fire. They traveled across the Pacific Ocean, waiting silently in transport ship holds, waiting for the day Marines would call for them. No one could predict then that these 8 tanks would rewrite the rules of warfare, that they would turn Japan's strongest fortress into a tomb. Meanwhile, on Iwo Jima itself, preparations took a different form. General Tada Michi Kuribayashi understood what many of his peers refused to accept. Japan could not match America's industrial might. His mission was not victory, but cost. Make the Americans bleed so heavily, they would hesitate before attacking Japan's home islands. Kuribayashi shattered centuries of Japanese military tradition. No banzai charges would waste his men's lives. No suicidal beach defenses would sacrifice troops uselessly. Instead, he ordered his soldiers underground. He would transform the entire island into a fortress. By February 1945, his engineers had carved 11 miles of tunnels through solid volcanic rock. Plans called for 17 miles total. Some chambers descended 7 stories deep. 5,000 caves and dugouts connected through hidden passageways created an underground city. Underground hospitals included operating theaters. Storage rooms held rice and water for months. Communications centers buried 75 feet down linked every position with telephone wire. Above ground, 1,500 concrete positions dotted the landscape, each one carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Pillboxes reinforced with 4 feet of concrete walls. Bunkers hidden behind steel shutters that opened only long enough to fire, then closed before American guns could respond. From Mount Suribachi in the south to the northern plateau, every inch was mapped and calculated. Kuribayashi stationed 21,000 men in this underground fortress. 2,000 defended the Suribachi area. 15,000 held the northern plateau under his direct command. A central reserve of 4,000 troops stood ready to move through tunnels wherever Americans achieved breakthrough. His doctrine was mathematical and merciless. Every Japanese soldier must kill 10 Americans before dying. For 74 days before the Marine landings, American battleships and bombers pounded Iwo Jima relentlessly. Nearly 7,000 tons of explosives fell from the sky. 22,000 naval shells churned the beaches into rubble and smoke. American planners felt confident the bombardment had destroyed most resistance. They projected the island would fall within 5 days. They were catastrophically wrong. When Marines stormed ashore on February 19, 1945, they met an enemy completely untouched by the bombardment. Fewer than 200 Japanese positions had been destroyed. The rest remained perfectly intact. Artillery and machine guns hidden in volcanic ridges erupted with deadly precision. By nightfall, more than 2,400 Marines lay dead or wounded. Still, the island's defenders waited silently underground. They conserved their strength for the battles ahead. Americans now faced not just enemy soldiers, but an entire subterranean fortress. Conventional weapons seemed powerless against such defenses. It was a problem requiring new solutions. On February 19th, the black beaches of Iwo Jima erupted under thunderous naval bombardment. 600 to 800 tons of explosives had already fallen that morning alone. 22,000 shells had reduced the island's surface to ash and rubble. American commanders remained confident despite the previous day's shocking casualties. They believed Japanese resistance would crumble under sustained pressure. But as successive waves of Marines charged ashore, that illusion died quickly. Hidden artillery positions opened fire from the cliffs above. Machine guns in buried pillboxes created precise killing fields. The volcanic sand itself betrayed the attackers. It clung to boots and equipment. It swallowed tank treads. It dragged men down as if the island wanted to claim them. By the second nightfall, another 2,000 Marines had fallen. The first objective, Airfield No. 1, remained in Japanese hands. Amid this carnage, 8 special tanks waited silently on landing ships offshore. The Shermans appeared ordinary to casual observers, but their crews understood the deadly secret they carried. These tanks held not explosive shells, but liquid fire. They represented America's hidden advantage. Orders were explicit. Hold them in reserve. Do not waste them in the initial chaos of the beachhead fighting. For 24 hours they sat idle with engines rumbling softly. Their crews grew increasingly restless as battle sounds carried across the water. Inside Tank 431, 5 men waited with growing tension. Staff Sergeant Robert Mesa commanded the crew. Gunner Corporal Thomas Carlson adjusted his periscope, repeatedly rehearsing firing angles. Loader Anthony Vitelli checked pressure gauges obsessively. 300 psi holding steady. Driver James Morrison shifted uneasily, listening to distant screams and explosions. They could see smoke columns rising from the island that seemed to devour every Marine who set foot on it. They knew with grim certainty their time would come soon. The morning of February 20th brought desperate news from the front lines. The 21st Marine Regiment was pinned down at Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 massive pillboxes dominated the airfield with interlocking fire. Anyone attempting to cross the open ground was cut down immediately. 2 rifle companies had been shredded in futile frontal assaults. Casualties mounted steadily by the hour. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis faced an impossible choice. His 3rd Battalion 21st Marines was being destroyed piecemeal. Conventional tactics had failed completely. At 10:20 hours, he made the decision that would change everything. He called for the Flamethrower tanks. At 14:20 hours that afternoon, Tank 431 lurched forward. Its steel treads crushed aircraft wreckage and bodies alike. The 35-ton Sherman advanced through volcanic ash that tried to swallow its weight. To Japanese defenders peering through firing slits, it appeared identical to dozens of other American tanks they had already engaged. They aimed their anti-tank guns with practiced precision. They prepared for another conventional duel of steel against steel. Then came the sound that would haunt their nightmares. A sharp hiss like steam, escaping under enormous pressure. Through his periscope, Corporal Carlson locked onto a pillbox aperture 125 yards away. His finger found the trigger. He squeezed gently. A jet of liquid fire erupted from the tank's main gun. Thick, flaming gel roared across the distance before slamming into the concrete bunker. The fire poured through the machine gun port like molten lava. It filled the interior space in seconds. Inside the pillbox, oxygen vanished almost instantly. Men suffocated before the flames could reach them. Those who staggered toward rear exits were shot down by Marines waiting in the smoke outside. Tank 431 traversed slowly to the next target. The turret swung with mechanical precision. Another burst of fire erupted. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun fired point-blank into the Sherman's frontal armor. The shell created a shower of sparks and metal fragments. The tank absorbed the impact and continued moving forward. Another jet of flame consumed the anti-tank position completely. In mere minutes, fortifications that had withstood 2 days of desperate assaults simply ceased to exist. Marines surged forward across ground they had been unable to cross for 48 hours. They advanced 400 yards in the afternoon, more progress than the previous 2 days combined. Word spread through the Marine ranks like wildfire itself. The flame tanks worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. By nightfall, all 8 modified Shermans had been committed to battle. Tank 434 operated near East Boat Basin. It destroyed 4 major bunkers in a single afternoon of fighting. The crew pioneered a maneuver they called corkscrew and burn. They circled enemy positions while spraying fire in spirals. This suppressed Japanese gunners before they could aim effectively. Tank 437 worked directly with Marine engineers to methodically clear strongpoints. Their technique was brutally efficient. Flame first to kill the defenders. Explosives afterward to seal the position permanently. No bunker could be reoccupied once they finished with it. Then there was Tank 432 operating at the base of Mount Suribachi. It faced a complex network of interconnected caves. The gunner made an unusual decision. Instead of firing directly into cave entrances, he aimed into the open air above them. A short warning burst, a demonstration of power. The psychological effect was immediate and shocking. Japanese soldiers poured out of the caves, fleeing through rear exits they had never intended to use. For the first time in anyone's memory, Imperial Japanese troops abandoned defensive positions rather than die in them. Marines watched in complete amazement as enemy defenders surrendered their fortress without firing a shot. The balance of power on Iwo Jima had shifted permanently. These tanks were no longer just machines of war. They had become symbols of hope to Marines and terror to Japanese defenders. Every subsequent battle plan was rewritten around their capabilities. Infantry attacks were delayed until flame tanks could arrive to support them. Marines learned to follow exactly 50 yards behind the tanks, close enough to exploit the shock and confusion, far enough to avoid the searing heat and backdraft. Artillery observers began marking targets not for conventional shell fire, but for streams of liquid flame. The entire nature of warfare on Iwo Jima had been fundamentally transformed. By February 23, 1945, the battle had reached its critical turning point. Marines had raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi that morning. The iconic photograph would symbolize triumph to the world. But seasoned fighters understood the real struggle was only beginning. To the north lay a far more formidable fortress, Hill 382, which Marines had nicknamed the Meat Grinder. Beyond that stretched twisted ravines where General Kuribayashi's strongest defenses remained completely intact. Here, the ultimate fate of Iwo Jima would be decided in fire and blood. Into this hellish landscape rolled the flame-throwing Shermans. The approach to Hill 382 was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. 7 stories of interconnected tunnels honeycombed the volcanic rock. Concrete pillboxes overlooked every possible avenue of approach. Interlocking artillery and mortar fire covered the ground so precisely that Marines joked bitterly that the Japanese had pre-sighted every grain of volcanic sand. Previous frontal assaults had bled entire battalions white within hours. Casualty rates soared past 50% in some units. One regiment lost 70% of its effective strength, merely reaching the base of the slopes. On the morning of February 23rd, 4 flamethrower Shermans advanced in tight echelon formation. Conventional tanks rumbled alongside, providing covering fire. Behind this armored spearhead, an entire battalion of Marines crouched low. They prepared to follow the inevitable wall of liquid fire. The Japanese defenders were waiting with their own surprises. Hidden 75mm mountain guns had been carefully positioned and camouflaged. These weapons were larger and deadlier than the common 47mm anti-tank guns. They had been held in reserve specifically for this climactic moment. As Tank 433 crested the first volcanic rise, the entire hillside seemed to explode simultaneously. A high-velocity shell smashed directly into the Sherman's left track assembly. The track exploded in a shower of steel links and rubber pads. The tank was immobilized, but not destroyed. The crew refused to abandon their disabled vehicle. From their stationary position, they continued firing the flamethrower again and again. They created a continuous curtain of liquid fire that blinded Japanese gunners. More importantly, they shielded the other advancing tanks from accurate enemy fire. Their sacrifice bought precious time for the assault. Through the dense smoke and flame tank, 431 pushed steadily forward. Shell fragments rattled against its armor plating like metallic hail. Driver James Morrison later described the terrifying experience in vivid detail. You could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. The entire world consisted of nothing but flame and choking smoke. You drove purely by instinct and prayer. At exactly 60 yards from the main Japanese stronghold tank, 434 unleashed a massive blast of liquid fire. But this time, something was drastically different from previous engagements. Instead of fire rushing through the aperture and consuming everything inside the bunker's firing port, suddenly sealed shut. Steel plates slammed closed with metallic clangs. The Japanese defenders had adapted to this new threat. They had welded movable steel barriers over all firing ports. These could be closed instantly between the tank's fire bursts. Liquid flames splashed harmlessly against the glowing metal barriers. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the flamethrower tanks had finally met their technological match. Then, Gunner Corporal Michael Rodriguez made a decision that would enter Marine Corps legend. Instead of firing the regulation 2-second burst, he held the trigger down continuously. 15 seconds passed. 20 seconds. 30 seconds of sustained fire. The steel plate began glowing cherry red from the intense heat. It started to warp visibly under the thermal stress. At 45 seconds, and dangerously long burst by any standard, the metal plate finally buckled under the extreme temperature. Liquid fire poured through the expanding cracks like water through a broken dam. Inside the bunker, stored ammunition began exploding in sympathetic detonations. The concrete walls themselves cracked from thermal shock and explosive pressure. Within minutes, the supposedly impregnable bunker had ceased to exist entirely. Marines surged forward immediately, while engineers rushed up with satchel charges. The position that had stopped multiple battalion-strength assaults was permanently breached. Across the battlefield, other tank crews were evolving new tactics in real time under combat conditions. The corkscrew and burn technique was perfected under fire. Spiraling approaches toward enemy strongpoints while spraying suppressive fire. This prevented Japanese gunners from taking careful aim. Others developed the breach and clear method. Flamethrower attack followed immediately by demolition charges. This sealed bunkers, permanently preventing any possible reoccupation. Tank 437 achieved perhaps the most devastating single performance of the entire Iwo Jima campaign. Working in close coordination with Marine combat engineers, the crew neutralized 7 major bunkers in one afternoon. Positions that had stopped entire battalions for days became passable terrain within hours. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating moment occurred at Mount Suribachi's northern base. There, Tank 432 faced an extensive network of interconnected cave systems. Commander Staff Sergeant William Patterson gave his gunner a simple but brilliant order. Fire one short burst directly into the air above the caves. Do not aim at the cave entrances themselves. The liquid fire did not touch the caves directly. It was purely a demonstration of the weapon's terrifying power. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Dozens of Japanese soldiers fled their positions in panic. They abandoned caves they had been ordered to defend to the death. Stunned Marines watched in disbelief as enemy troops deserted without firing a single shot in resistance. For the first time in the entire Pacific War, Japanese resistance had cracked. Not from overwhelming firepower, but from pure psychological terror. The mental impact of the flamethrower tanks was undeniable and irreversible. Yet for all their devastating effectiveness, these weapons were not invincible. On March 11th, Tank 438 was struck by a Japanese suicide attacker. The soldier had explosives strapped to his body. He threw himself against the Sherman's rear engine compartment. The explosion tore through the armor plating and into the engine bay. 3 crew members died instantly in the blast and fire. It served as a sobering reminder that innovation alone could not eliminate the human cost of warfare. Still, for every tank destroyed or damaged, another returned to action. Disabled vehicles were dragged back to repair facilities. Seabees and mechanics worked through the night under enemy fire. Repaired tanks returned to battle the next morning. This cycle of destruction and rebirth mirrored the battle itself. Relentless, grinding, merciless warfare where both sides paid in blood. The final climax came during the last week of March, at a place Marines called the Bloody Gorge. In this narrow ravine less than 700 yards wide, General Kuribayashi had gathered his last 3,000 defenders. Every cave, every crevice, every tunnel entrance bristled with concentrated firepower. It was intended as the final desperate stand of the Japanese garrison. On March 21st, 6 operational flamethrower tanks led the decisive assault. 4 additional tanks rushed from Hawaii provided support. These newer models were less sophisticated but still deadly effective. The tanks advanced in crescent formation, creating overlapping streams of liquid fire. No shadows remained where defenders could hide from the flames. Marines followed closely behind, throwing white phosphorus grenades into cave mouths. The grenades marked targets for the tank crews. Engineers moved up immediately afterward, sealing positions with explosive charges. The entire gorge became a single massive inferno. Japanese suicide squads erupted from concealed spider holes. They were cut down before reaching their intended targets. Anti-tank guns fired at point-blank range. Their crews were engulfed in flame, even as they loaded the next round. One Japanese officer charged directly toward Tank 434. He carried a traditional samurai sword raised above his head. The bow machine gunner froze momentarily in shock at the sight. Marine riflemen fired from multiple positions simultaneously. The sword fell into the volcanic ash beside its owner. By sunset, more than 800 Japanese defenders lay dead in the gorge. Over 8,000 gallons of napalm fuel mixture had been consumed in a single day. This established a record for the entire Iwo Jima campaign. Marine casualties were still heavy, as they had been throughout the battle. But losses were significantly lower than any conventional frontal assault would have demanded. Victory, however, carried its own psychological shadows for the American crews. Tank operators spoke privately about the sounds they could never forget. The screams were brief, but terrible. and absolutely unforgettable. Corporal Carlson admitted years later that the memories haunted him. We did what military necessity demanded of us, but at night, when everything was quiet, you could still hear those voices. Maintenance crews discovered their own psychological burdens. They found human remains fused directly to tank treads. Bodies burned into the steel itself. Blowtorches were required to scrape the remains away before the vehicles could return to action. War had transformed technology into an instrument of horror. American soldiers had become the keepers of liquid fire. When the final guns fell silent on March 26, 1945, Iwo Jima was declared officially secure. 36 days of continuous slaughter had carved permanent scars into history. The Americans had lost 26,000 casualties, with 6,821 confirmed dead. The Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated. Of 21,000 original defenders, only 216 survived to surrender. Most cited the same reason for giving up. They preferred captivity to burning alive. The flamethrower tanks had broken more than concrete bunkers. They had shattered the legendary Japanese will to fight to the death. Yet victory came at a psychological price that shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Entire Marine battalions had been reduced to company strength. The black volcanic sands were carpeted with wreckage bodies and the permanent scars of explosions. But survivors understood a simple mathematical truth. Without the 8 flamethrower tanks, the human cost would have been catastrophically higher. Statistics documented the weapon's effectiveness with brutal clarity. More than 1,000 fortified Japanese positions had been destroyed by flame weapons. 30% of all enemy casualties were directly attributable to flamethrowers, both portable and tank-mounted versions. In sectors where the flame tanks operated, American casualty rates dropped by nearly 40%. Military analysts calculated that approximately 5,000 Marine lives had been saved. 8 machines conceived in secret Hawaiian workshops had fundamentally altered the mathematics of death on Iwo Jima. Japanese responses in those final desperate days revealed the weapon's psychological impact. Suicide squads targeted the flame tanks specifically. Snipers concentrated on the narrow vision slits, hoping to blind the crews. Every available anti-tank weapon was directed at the modified Shermans. But these efforts proved futile. The tanks appeared identical to regular armor until the crucial moment. By then, the distinctive hiss had already sounded. The jets of liquid fire were already pouring toward their targets. General Kuribayashi, in one of his final radio transmissions before being killed, acknowledged the unthinkable. The enemy's flame tanks have proven more devastating than their artillery or naval bombardment combined. We have developed no effective countermeasures. They transform our strongest defensive positions into crematoriums. The psychological cost extended beyond casualty statistics to the men who operated these weapons. Tank crews carried their own burden of memories. Men who had unleashed torrents of liquid fire into occupied bunkers spoke of nightmares that followed them home. Staff Sergeant Meza never overcame the auditory memories. You would hear the sounds for only a few seconds during combat. But at night, in the quiet darkness, you kept hearing them over and over. The screaming burns itself into your mind permanently. Maintenance personnel bore different, but equally lasting psychological scars. They scraped charred human remains from tank hulls and treads. They patched holes in armor that had been blackened by explosions and fire. They struggled to keep the machines operational while never forgetting what those machines had accomplished. For American military commanders, the lessons were unmistakably clear. The flamethrower tanks had not only saved thousands of American lives, they had demonstrated the future direction of warfare itself. Innovation, technology, and industrial superiority could overcome even the most fanatical human resistance. Individual courage alone was no longer sufficient for victory. For Japanese military leaders, the battle represented an unmitigated tragedy. Soldiers who had been trained and ordered to hold their positions to the last man instead abandoned them in terror. Interrogated prisoners consistently admitted that death by burning was the one fate they simply could not face. Traditional samurai values had been shattered not by conventional weapons, but by liquid fire. For the wider world beyond the immediate battlefield, the implications were profound and disturbing. The United States had captured an island closer to Japan's home territory than ever before. Airfields were constructed rapidly on the conquered ground. From Iwo Jima, American fighter planes could escort bomber formations directly to Tokyo itself. The island that had cost so much blood in lives and suffering became a crucial stepping stone toward ending the Pacific War. But the images that lingered in memory were not of victory parades or flag-raising ceremonies. They were of concrete bunkers burning from within, of cave systems transformed into furnaces, of men both American and Japanese haunted permanently by what liquid fire had accomplished. The battle for Iwo Jima had ended after 36 days of horror. The wider Pacific War would continue for several more months, but an important line had been crossed on those volcanic sands. The world had witnessed not only the deaths of thousands of soldiers, it had observed the birth of a new and terrifying form of warfare. In the cold mathematical calculations of military effectiveness, the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima represented a tiny fraction of America's arsenal. Only 8 Sherman tanks had been modified in secrecy and deployed on that cursed island. Yet their psychological and tactical impact reverberated far beyond those black volcanic beaches. The Marines who survived the battle would remember these weapons as the single most effective tool of the entire operation. Not the massive naval bombardments or endless artillery barrages. The tanks that expelled rivers of liquid fire had shattered fortresses previously thought to be impregnable. They had forced Japanese soldiers, men raised from childhood to die without surrender, to abandon their sworn positions in panic. That psychological breakthrough marked a fundamental turning point in Pacific warfare. It demonstrated that even the most fanatical resistance could be broken, not only through superior firepower, but through technological innovation that transcended conventional military thinking. The United States military establishment took careful note of these lessons. Within months, dozens of additional flamethrower Shermans were ordered for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa. There, too, they would prove strategically decisive in reducing cave systems that conventional weapons could never touch effectively. Military doctrine evolved rapidly to incorporate combined arms tactics. Armor infantry and combat engineers, all working in precise coordination with liquid fire as the spearhead. For the Marine Corps specifically, the lessons were unambiguous and permanent. Technological adaptation and innovation were every bit as vital as individual courage and fighting spirit. After the Pacific War ended, the technological lineage continued unbroken for decades. Flamethrower tanks rumbled across Korean hillsides during that conflict. Their jets of fire cleared Chinese and North Korean bunkers at famous battlefields like the Punch Bowl and Heartbreak Ridge. Into the 1960s and 1970s, the M132 armored flamethrower carried this deadly tradition forward. International law and evolving public conscience finally consigned such weapons to history. By 1978, the last American flamethrower tanks were officially retired from active service. Yet their legacy endures in military museums and in the memories of those who witnessed their terrible effectiveness. At Quantico, Virginia, one surviving Iwo Jima flamethrower tank sits in permanent silent testimony. Modern visitors can observe the combat scars welded into its armor plating, the dents and holes from Japanese anti-tank shells, the blackened steel surfaces that bear witness to desperate fighting. What they cannot see or hear are the screams the weapon inspired, the terror it created in enemy bunkers. The American lives it, undoubtedly saved through its devastating psychological impact. Veterans who walk past this static display often pause longer than other visitors. Some render silent salutes to the machine and its crews. Others simply stare, haunted by memories they can never fully explain to those who were not there. For Japanese survivors, too, the memory has lingered across the decades since 1945. Former defenders have testified that the flamethrower tanks broke their fighting spirit in ways that conventional weapons never could. Underground tunnels that had promised safety became furnaces of liquid fire. Their personal courage had not failed them. Their defensive tactics had not failed them. But their collective imagination had been surpassed by American technological innovation. That remains the most enduring lesson of the Iwo Jima flamethrower tanks. The age of the individual warrior and the banzai charge had ended in flames on that volcanic island. The age of technological warfare had begun in earnest. In the Pacific's blood-soaked volcanic soil, liquid fire had proven what the future would inevitably hold. Wars would be won not only by the bravery of individual soldiers. They would be decided by the minds that conceived and built the machines of warfare. 8 tanks, 29,000 gallons of napalm fuel, mixture over 1,000 enemy positions, destroyed thousands of American lives saved and thousands of Japanese lives incinerated. The final balance sheet of history, written in liquid fire and human ashes. As the smoke cleared from Iwo Jima's conquered landscape, one truth remained absolutely clear. Human imagination, channeled through industrial technology, would decide the outcome of future conflicts more than steel or individual fighting spirit alone.